Buenas tardes. Very, very courageous. um, thank you so much for having me here. And I am very, very proud and honored that I got re-invited. Last year, I called Robin and told her I couldn't make it. My mom had just passed, and she was so gracious and so great. And so she gave me the time and space to deal with that. So here I am, and I promised her that I would address the theme she asked me to address the year before. So I actually have a different title than what you have in your program, precisely because I was trying to get closer and closer to what she asked me to do. So hopefully this will be helpful to everybody. And what it is that in 1989, I published a paper that, oddly enough, had more impact in organization and the organizational world than it did anywhere else, including psychology, because I think it was a way for us to think about some of the dynamics that we've been talking about today. And in that 1989 article, I proposed that different groups of women had different relationships to white patriarchy, and that that relationship was largely determined through familial ties, and that that the white patriarchy as a system of privilege needed, especially upper middle class white women, to reproduce itself biologically, given that race is largely determined by the biological composition of both parents. In this case, I want to make clear that when I say race, I put that in quotation marks because one of the big contributions that many of you in this room have made is to understand that race is socially constructed and not a biological variable. But we nonetheless categorize people by very broad and very awkward and very messy phenotypic characteristics into different racial categories, and then we allow them a certain level of privilege and access depending on that categorization. Consequently, then white women, especially educated white women, become essential to this system of racial privilege. In comparison, simultaneously, the maintenance of white race privilege, especially at the most undesirable jobs, are very much dependent on a workforce that is highly racialized and composed by people of color and are biologically reproduced by women of color. And so the consequences or the closeness to white patriarchy is very different. And so the acquiescence of white women to this system of privilege, especially through the socialization and I would say to a certain extent, indoctrination into a nuclear white marriage is essential for how things exist in our society. And so the mechanism by which white women are asked to acquiesce are basically through a system of rewards, and they're very real. They're material, they're social, they are to a large extent essential for having a decent life in the kind of society that we live. So that what I was proposing in this paper, and I can't believe I did this so many years ago because it's still pretty transgressive, that it was done through a system of seduction, that you couldn't beat women into acquiescence, but that you had to offer these rewards. It's a desirable lifestyle. It's a way to have meaning in your life, and that the seduction was started very early on. So this was not the case for women of color because you did not need them in the same way, and therefore white patriarchy rejected them as an integral part of reproducing this privilege. So the relationship that different women had to the reproduction of white patriarchy will also influence their feminisms and their feminist concerns. And so what I was trying to do in 1989 is get away from the explanation of differences between feminists of color and white feminists as solely relying on women just fighting each other, and that there was a larger structure that could help us understand the differences in emphasis in different feminist agendas. And so the power dynamics end up influencing also the communication and how it is that we get along with each other, because we are coming from these two very different perspectives in terms of our relationship to how power is distributed. And so I was asked to update these dynamics and their consequences for solidarity and political mobilization among women, regardless of race, class, sexuality, ethnicity, and physical ableness. And that's what I didn't do last time. Primarily the reason for doing this is that, you figured, well, after all these 27 years, maybe things have changed, and I can come up here and say that we all get along really well, we all, work together, and we have a very coherent feminist agenda regardless of our differences. And I'm sad to say, although it kind of makes sense, that it's still the dynamics that I outline in this paper are very much persistent. And one of the reasons is, and it makes logical sense, that I was basically making the analysis on a structural analysis, so therefore structures of privilege are very, very difficult to change, and it would make no sense that they would change in 27 years. So let me talk about the little change that has happened, and then talk a little bit about how this has affected women's feminisms. The structural differences between women of color and white women still remain such that white women are more educated, earn more money, and hold a higher socioeconomic position as a group than women of color. So the persistence of this inequality between women of color and white women as a group, as women, are still very consistent and persistent. Furthermore, these privileges are still the same also for the white patriarchy, so that most of the wealth and most of the leadership positions and most of the structural ability to decide which way our country should go is still very much in the hands of white patriarchy. And I won't talk about Trump right now. And so therefore the contours of these dynamics are the same. And so the initial premise of the article, an eventual book, that subordination for white women comes through seduction and the privileges obtained through the familial relationship with white patriarchy, and the subordination of women of color comes through rejection, is pretty much, I think, a pretty sound way of thinking about these dynamics. However, I don't want to leave you there because you look very sad right now. I do want to tell you what it is that has changed, and it's in the grander scheme of things, it's a small change, but I think it's a very significant change, and one that I think will be revolutionary in about 20 years. So I intend to be here. I don't know about you guys. So that we can think critically about how it is that we can manage this tipping point and how things are changing and why it is that they are changing. So structurally, the biggest change for white women has been the increasing success within the educational circles, and to a certain extent, their economic success. White women are still are at a disadvantage when compared to white men in terms of pay, but the gap is getting closer, and I think most importantly, almost every field now is dominated by white women. So much so is that I think we're on the verge of having a white men's movement, because every single graduate school and every single arena, including starting with high school, college, graduate school, law school, medical school, and there are only a few arenas where the study of white women, where the women are not the white women are not the majority, and these are very specialized fields like physics and certain fields of study like technology and engineering, and I think that's probably going to change within the 5 to 7 years. So the increase educational achievement of white women, however, has not manifested itself in the accumulation of wealth. The accumulation of wealth really takes much longer than simply a meritocracy, a rise of meritocracy and opening of institutions of higher education. But more than likely, this accumulation of wealth will happen within 20 years. So your daughters, for example, will probably at minimum have a house that they will inherit from you, which would automatically put them as 1%ers, because most women don't own property, including very educated women. So just to give you a sense of what this means structurally, I was trying to find a device where this would be visual and fast and quick. So I was blessed because the whole controversy happened about the Oscars also white, because they didn't have any people of color nominated. And the New York Times did this fabulous snapshot of how the lack of diversity within the highest ranking areas of decision making. So let me go through these very quickly. And I'm not gonna spend a lot of time discussing each slide, but what you need to pay attention to is when there's no yellow circle, it means that there is no diversity. So this is where the title of the article appears, is The Faces of American Power, Nearly as White as the Oscar Nominees. So here you have the top military advisors. You have no yellow circle or square. Hollywood executives who choose which movies are made. They chose to include white women as part of the power structure, so the only diversity here is an Asian man. And so in terms of leaders of the largest American companies, you have some white women and a little bit of diversity towards the bottom. The mayors of the America's largest cities, again, predominantly white men with a few white women. Owners of men's pro football teams, you only have one person of color. And let me also specify, when there is a man of color, they tend to be foreign-born, very wealthy foreigners who come to the US to make their fortune bigger. And here the owners of the men's basketball teams, again, you only have Michael Jordan is the only man of color. And this is also important to note that the people that they're owning are predominantly people of color in these sports. Owners of men's pro baseball teams, only one man of color. People who wield the most influence over which books Americans read, only a couple of people of color. People who decide what music gets produced, only one person of color. People who decide which television shows Americans see. Oh, and that if Shonda Rhimes gets an illness and dies, we're in deep trouble, because she's like 100% of our diversity is because of her. Presidents of Ivy League universities, not a single person of color, although we have a few white women. And the president and his cabinet, which if we get Trump, I would love to see this graphic, it's still not the majority. American governors, still very few. And people who decide what news gets covered, only a couple people. US senators, and I wouldn't personally count Ted Cruz, but okay. Or Rubio for that matter, but just teasing. And then the United States Supreme Court, and obviously Sotomayor was appointed by President Obama. So the lack of diversity and you know, we can debate the word diversity, and I think the critique of diversity was a valid one this morning, but I think it gives us, when you look at the bodies, whatever you want to call the lack of, it's a very homogeneous body of people that are making the most important decisions in our society. And I think that that's a very good backdrop for us to have this conversation and for us to think about what importance is our work, given that this is the power structure we have to deal with, and it's going to be for quite a while, although I am really relying on my white feminist sisters to change this. So the latest concern about this, the increasing divide between those that make power and those that receive that power, is what many are calling savage inequalities, right? So as the wealth gets accumulated by a very small number of people, the majority in the changing demographics are now there are people of color, and so that the distance is growing bigger and bigger. So what I argued in my 1989 piece was that because of these structural differences, their feminist agendas were different. And I proposed different areas where this feminist agenda was different, and also what remedies were being proposed by these two groups of women given their different structural positions. And, but I only want to cover one today as an illustration. And this is the loss of children. So in 1989, I said one of the differences that keep putting a wedge between white women feminists and feminists of color is that historically, women of color have always lost their children at much higher rates than white women. And so the sort of preoccupation with how the state controls your parenting, you're able to raise healthy kids, you're able to protect your kids, has a historical basis. And I used the quote by Sojourner Truth about bearing 13 children in a meeting where she was arguing and I've seen them sold off to slavery, and certainly that wasn't the case with the women, the white women abolitionists she was sitting with, who were actually encouraged to reproduce themselves. So that persistence has continued to where we know these statistics all too well. Unarmed black people were killed by police 5 times the rate of unarmed whites in 2015. And I could give you tons. I mean, when people are going to be, these data are so powerful, they're going to be writing books for the next 30 years. So the loss of children is still a very big divide between feminists of color and white feminists. And at the same time that we've become much more aware of this loss of children, we also have become aware of how early this criminalization starts happening. So there's now repeated reports of kids in preschool, mostly African-American kids, and this is one article about a 6-year-old student in Georgia who threw a temper tantrum in the principal's office. She wasn't even in the classroom, and she got handcuffed. And I didn't want to put her picture up because I think that her privacy should be protected, so we are now cannibalizing these young kids to a certain extent. So as a result of this kind of grotesque intrusion of the state into the reproduction of our kids, the Black Lives Matter movement emerged, actually organized or co-founded by Afro-Latina young woman. And so that she's a feminist, she cares about gender, yet her whole mobilization is around these issues having to do with men. So, and this is also certainly the case with undocumented kids coming across the US-Mexican border, where they are put in detention centers actually designed for adults and basically are incarcerated. So these are all young kids. I don't see if you can see them. And they're being covered by aluminum. They don't have blankets, they don't have beds, and basically they are handcuffed and they are treated, they follow protocols, so they treat them like adults, and they're terrified because they're kids. And so that the inability for the system to see them as kids and treat them appropriately, I think is an indication of how used to we've gotten to criminalizing children of color. Simultaneously, there has been an incredibly heightened preoccupation with the reproduction of privilege among upper middle class white women, where a lot of their efforts and energies are devoted to having their offspring attend the best preschools and kindergarten, so they are assured entrance into the most exclusive institutions in the country. and there is this kind of obsession with only going to Ivy League schools. So this endeavor takes an enormous amount of time, energy, resources, and thought to ensure that their offspring will do as well as parents, as well as the parents, or perhaps even better. So these gendered activities that are placed primarily on the shoulders of upper middle class white women who also may be bringing in a substantial amount of income, I think robs them away from any sort of a political or civic engagement beyond the nuclear family, because they are stressed to the max. I mean, they are like panicked. If you see this little article, just that paragraph, I would be scared if I was in that situation, because it makes you feel you either go to Harvard or you're nothing, right? It's sort of like it's all or nothing. And so I think that preoccupation and that narrative has really caged the energies of the women that created the feminist movement in the 60s, who came from very privileged classes and who then dedicated themselves to changing things for everybody, not just for their nuclear family. So I'm going to go really fast now. So I think that our biggest contribution as feminists has been the transformation of our discourse, and I created a word cloud. I got inspired by the conference to sort of remind us what arsenal of words and concepts we created to uncover the hidden dynamics of gender and sexual subordination. And so that when Gloria Steinem said, these young women don't understand, they are just following the guys, I think that what she didn't explicitly say is, we have now internalized these changes so profoundly that we've created this wonderful generation of young women who don't have to worry about these sexist dynamics until much later in their lives. And so that it used to be around 11, they became gendered women, right, at 11. Now, I think what is happening is they're becoming gendered women like around, I don't know, 35, when you're going to go on your second marriage. My advisor used to say, Aida, second marriages are always better. So that, and also we've created a new generation of very sweet, feminist, gender-conscious, young, educated men. So even my latest book, And Beyond Machismo, we interviewed 105 Latino young men between the ages of 20 and 30, and 86 of them identified as feminist. And it came largely through the transformation of higher education. And so that we have created this beautiful kind of, and we need to give each other credit, because this morning with I forgot her name, Anna, I guess, Anna Holmes, it was very sweet. I was so proud of myself. She just thought it happened. You know, like these changes just happened, rather than they were very hard-won battles and scars and people not getting tenured for writing these things. But that's good. That's the way social change should happen, so that the beneficiaries of that social change actually don't have to wait till their husband is retired twice before she can run for president, right? So Hillary Clinton didn't become a free woman till she was 60-some years old, whereas I think we're now freeing our girls very early on so they can have real lives. And part of this transformation has been with young men as well. So when Mark Zuckerman took two months of maternity leave, everybody was like so shocked, and I'm thinking, no, we created that. You know, he came through our classrooms, he read our stuff, his wife read our stuff, and his wife is saying, you're gonna take time off, right? So the expectations that we've created came out of the ugly struggle of burning your bra and not shaving your legs and, you know, being a man-hater, if you wanted to call it that. And we need to remind ourselves that that's the way social change happens. That when it happens, it seems ugly, it seems one-sided, it seems we're doing to them what they did to us. And if you persist, this is what you get. And to me, that was a reminder. I mean, I really am very grateful to people like Nancy Henley, and Candace West, who talked about conversational dynamics as essential to imposing power and to controlling classrooms and to not allowing women to speak. And so that all these changes, I think, should help us with the next phase of our feminisms, which I would like to say we need to go beyond relating to privilege to the deconstruction of privilege as one of our biggest feminist goals. Thank you so much.